Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
By now, you know that I'm a big fan of mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches for the treatment of chronic pain, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. If you look at studies, an increasing number of Americans are using some type of integrative or contemplative practice on a daily or a weekly basis to improve upon their physical health as well as their mental health. One of the reasons why I love mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches so much is because as practitioners, we're faced with an increasingly complex, more chronic, and more diseased professional landscape. The other reason is I believe we've arrived at a place where we can no longer separate the brain from the body or the mind from the body, however you'd like to look at it. Just consider for a moment that there's a well-known, backed by evidence and science, strong positive association between living in a state of stress, which then turns into emotional distress, and then finally on to mental illness. And that there's a bidirectional relationship between mental illness and physical illness that's inseparable. Currently, 1 in 5 Americans lives with a mental illness. That's about 52 million people. And there have been surveys of physical therapists working in a general orthopedic practice where 75% report treating comorbid mental health problems on a daily or a weekly basis. Mindfulness and acceptance-based interventions are a family of methods that emphasize a present moment awareness, non-judgmental stance, and employ values-based living. The techniques and exercises embedded in these methods teach you how to cope with stressful thoughts, stressful emotions, and even painful physical sensations. The goal is not to clear the mind or to prevent difficult emotions or thoughts from occurring. We don't really have a great way to do that. It's about learning how to relate differently to all your experiences, even the distressing ones, as part of our human experience. These methods are useful in clinical practice, especially if you're aiming for health promotion, improving physical function, injury prevention, pain management, modulating the immune system, alleviating non-communicable disease, and even improving sports performance. Mindfulness is much more than meditation. These are thoroughly investigated, science-backed, and proven methods of health behavior change. We begin today with meditation teacher Sharon Salzberg.
How do you describe or define mindfulness?
It is described in a lot of different ways. My common description would be a quality of awareness of your experience in the present moment so that your perception of what's happening is not distorted by bias. Sometimes, say, a certain emotion would arise and we don't like it. We don't want to admit we have it. And so we just kind of shove it away a little bit. Or we might well have the habit of projecting into the future, and especially around uncomfortable, painful, difficult emotions or physical sensations. I certainly have that habit. When painful feeling arises, I see my mind right away saying, what's it going to feel like in 5 minutes? What's it going to feel like in 10 minutes? So I'm not just being with what is, which may be difficult enough, but I've now added a really long future, and I try to bear it all at once, and I feel overcome. So that's the kind of habit that we all have one form or another of, and will arise very commonly, but we can see it in mindfulness. We can see it and let go of it. So we come back to our original experience in a much kind of cleaner way.
And up next is Dr. Kristen Neff.
Weaving mindfulness work into those with chronic pain is so important. And the concept of compassion, and especially self-compassion, which people just have to start to open the door and kind of peek into when it comes to living with chronic pain or a chronic illness. I think the best way to lead into this today is just to give us your definition of what self-compassion is and why it's so important.
Yeah, well, I think especially for people with chronic pain, self-compassion is absolutely key. So just to say there is a lot of overlap between mindfulness and self-compassion. In fact, the first step of self-compassion is to be mindful you're in pain, either emotional pain or physical pain, and to be able to relate to that pain with kind of an accepting stance instead of fighting it and resisting it. I wish I wasn't feeling this pain, which sadly we know just makes things worse. Kind of accepting, okay, this is a reality. I'm feeling pain, and giving it space, very key. But, we don't want to just stop there. We want the heart to be involved as well, not just our awareness. And so what self-compassion does is it adds two components to mindfulness. First is warmth and kindness. In other words, you could acknowledge you're in pain and you don't want to fight it, but at the same time, it's like, ouch, it hurts. I'm so sorry I'm in pain. That tenderness, that care, just like if you have a friend or a child who's in pain, you just naturally say, oh, I'm so sorry. And that there's a warmth and tenderness and concern that goes toward the person in pain. We can actually do that with ourselves. And it also really helps us hold the pain when we're able to have that warmth and tenderness toward ourselves. So kindness, love, really, if you want to be non-scientific about it, it really is love. But then there's another element that's really crucial, and that's remembering humanity, really, connectedness. I mean, if you look at the root of the word compassion, it means compassion, suffer with. Passion means suffer, come means with. So inherent to the state of compassion is some sense of, this is the human condition. We're all imperfect. We all lead imperfect lives.
Then it's on to Harvard neuroscientist Sarah Lazar.
So when we talk about mindfulness now, we talk a lot about the brain and pain on this podcast. When we talk about mindfulness, maybe first, what types of effects do we see that mindfulness has on the brain?
Right. So we have done a lot with brain structure. And so we have shown both in long-term meditation practitioners and in novices that there are differences in brain structure. And so by that, what we mean is we took people who had never ever practiced meditation before. We randomized them to either go through meditation or go through just a weightless control. So we scanned them 8 weeks apart, but they didn't do anything in between those 8 weeks. And what we saw is that the people who went through the meditation program had an actual increase in gray matter in their brain, in certain brain regions, compared to the controls who didn't go through the program. And this is not, a lot of people are like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's well known that, if you train someone to do something new, their brain will change. So the fact that their brain was changing was not necessarily earth-shattering, other than that most people thought that meditation, you're just sitting there not doing anything, right? Yeah. So there's sort of validation for them that, meditation is actually something active. And then what we were interested in is where changed. Because that gives us important clues as to what's happening during meditation. And so the areas that we saw changing, one was the hippocampus, which is an area involved with learning and memory. One is the PCC, which has to do with self-reference and how this is relevant to me. And another region is down in the brainstem, and it's an area involved in releasing neurotransmitters. And we saw that the change in that region correlated with well-being. So people reported being happier if that region changed. And then the last region we found was the amygdala. So the amygdala got smaller. And the amygdala is all about fight or flight and fear and stress. And so, again, as that got smaller, people reported less stress. So these changes are consistent with the self-report of what people are talking about of how it impacting them.
That was great. Now it's meditation teacher and fellow New Yorker, Emily Fletcher.
Talk to us about the time factor, because as you mentioned, that's oftentimes the first obstacle or the biggest barrier for people. Yeah. Do you start people out with a certain amount and then build them up, or do you recommend they continue with a certain amount for a period of time? What's the kind of frequency and duration of the dose that you're recommending in your program?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The devil's in the dose and the details matter. And so I recommend for people that don't have any meditation training, who've never taken a class or read a book or taken an online course, I would recommend 0 minutes of meditation. And I know that seems crazy, but it is a skill. It's a skill like any other. And you would not challenge yourself to a 21-day Japanese challenge if you had never learned to speak the language Japanese. And so I don't understand why people are challenging themselves to meditate if they don't actually know how to meditate. And so I think it's first acknowledging that it is a skill. And once you learn it and you have a technique that's designed for you and not a monk, then it's ridiculously enjoyable and ridiculously simple. And it can actually give you a return on your time investment. And I find what a lot of people are doing in this day and age when meditation has become so popular and there's so many apps and drop-in studios and free YouTube videos is that people are trying to like dumb down the experience or just almost like placate the not interested by being like, just do 1 minute, just do one mindful breath. And like, sure, that's better than taking a shot of tequila, but it's not going to change your life. Like one mindful breath, like, sure, it might keep you from having a stress reaction, but it's not ultimately going to usher you into higher states of consciousness. It's not ultimately going to increase your cognitive performance. And so if you're really interested in up-leveling your physical and mental game, you're going to have to make an investment. You're going to have to surrender something. And so what I recommend is once you have some training at Ziva, we teach 15 minutes twice a day. And I know that sounds like an extraordinary amount of time, but it's like 15 minutes before coffee, breakfast, or computer, and then about 15 minutes before your evening meal. So where you would have had the coffee or the chocolate or the nap, that's where you want to steal away and do your second meditation. And what I found, and I did the math on this, it's actually 2% of your day. Those 2 15-minute chunks is 2% of your day. And when you frame it like that, when you ask the question, am I willing to invest 2% of my day so that the other 98% can be more productive, more fun, more amazing, so I can get better sleep, better sex, better parking karma, reverse my body age, decrease my pain receptivity? Then the answer is, of course I would do that. But if we think about meditation as like a cute pedicure for your brain, like something you'll get around to when you have more time, and a lot of people think that because the types that they're doing are not designed for them. They're designed for monks, so they're not seeing a return on their time investment. And of course, you don't have time for something that's not going to give you dividends on your investment. So long story short, if you get a technique designed for you and not a monk, and you get some training, then you should be seeing a legit ROI. Like you should actually start to have more time in your day because your sleep really should get more efficient. Your serendipity, your creativity, your flow state, like all of that stuff changes precipitously and quickly. And then you actually see like, how could I not meditate?
And then we have psychologist Ronald Siegel.
There was a little bit about how mindfulness can be used as a tool to increase our awareness.
Well, mindfulness is, even though probably most of your listeners are somewhat familiar with it, a lot of people have a little bit of confusion about what we mean when we talk about mindfulness. And as I'm using it here, talking about any awareness of present experience with loving acceptance. So it means being alert, being in the present moment, and having this open attitude of loving acceptance toward whatever is occurring right now. As it turns out, most of what we see when we start doing mindfulness practices, which are activities such as following the breath or walking and noticing the sensation of the feet touching the ground, when we do these practices that involve stepping out of the thought stream and coming back to moment sensory experience, one of the things that happens is we develop metacognitive awareness. We develop the ability to see thoughts as thoughts rather than as realities that we identify with, a principle found, for example, in most ACT approaches to treatment. We also start to notice certain phenomena, such as every time I resist some kind of experience, whether it be a sensation of pain, thought, an image, a memory, the very act of constricting and resisting that experience actually amplifies it and actually turns it from being a transient event that arises and passes to being some kind of event that the organism becomes stuck in, where we get caught in some kind of recursive pattern in which we're resisting it so much, the very resistance fuels it, and then we resist more and we get stuck in that kind of pattern. So mindfulness practices give us insight into those kinds of mechanisms, but they also give us insight into how we construct our sense of self by talking to ourselves all day long. When we practice stepping out of the thought stream a lot, we start to notice that, hey, when the thoughts do arise, most of the thoughts are actually about me and about what I want, what I'm hoping will go well, what I'm hoping won't go well. Right now thinking, am I staying on the theme? Am I remembering what your question is? Is this going to be useful to listeners? This is what's going background even as I'm speaking in this moment. So mindful awareness is noticing that this is occurring and also noticing that all of this chatter basically about ourselves is, as Descartes pointed out years ago, I think, therefore I am. Our sense of me is constructed out of all of this talk.
And up next is Canadian physiotherapist Shelley Prosco.
Tell us what compassion is, so we have a little bit of context as we move forward through this episode with you.
Yeah, so there's really no one agreed upon definition. In the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, which is just a huge compendium of anything, everything that you need to know about compassion. In the working definition they use in there is a definition that is basically recognizing the suffering and then with the motivation to alleviate the suffering. And that could be the suffering or the struggling of others or even within yourself. So compassion includes self-compassion. So turning that recognition or acknowledgement of struggle or suffering, turning that onto yourself as well, and then having the motivation to alleviate it. So compassion, sometimes it's described as an emotion, sometimes as a behavior, sometimes as a motivation. So there, like I said, it's like language. With anything, it can be semantics as well, talking about what is it really. So for what I use it as, I go with what's in that Oxford Handbook, which is it's a combination of the recognition and the feeling and the emotion and then wanting to actually alleviate it and do something about it. So there's the behavioral aspect.
So the interesting distinction that I hear you making there is there are many people when they talk, they may say, oh, I feel bad, or I feel remorseful, or I feel sad about that person or that situation or this happening that's going on. But the motivation, the human drive to actually then change your behavior and help to affect that or to change that is really what sets compassion in motion.
Right. And the Joan Halifax, and introduce that name here, and you've had her on your show before too. She has this enactive model of compassion. So she actually has a little bit of a different definition and talks about compassion being more of a wisdom that emerges. So you can have this desire and these feelings, like you said, of maybe even empathizing with someone or feeling a kindness towards someone, but you have to go beyond that. And there's another aspect of actually doing something in the behavior. But with Joan's model, which we can talk about later, we don't need to jump to that now, but with her model, she says there's a little bit more to compassion than even just a motivation or a behavior. She says that it's actually an emergent process and it's contextual. So if you look at the therapeutic interaction, you've got the patient, you have the healthcare provider. What might be a compassionate response today in this moment, it might be completely different later on that day or the next day. So it's not just something that is linear. Here's what someone said, or here's what they're feeling, and here's what would be the appropriate response. It doesn't really necessarily work that way because we are humans are dynamical systems, right? You're an ecosystem, I'm an ecosystem. We have different experiences in this moment. And so when we come together, now what emerges is this more of this compassionate wisdom.
Australian psychologist and researcher Dr. Melissa Day. Tell us the difference between traditional cognitive behavioral therapy and a mindfulness-based approach to pain. And I guess maybe we should talk about it from a psychological intervention. So, of course, mindfulness meditation, you can go to a mindfulness center. You may be working with someone who's certified in mindfulness. But, of course, in your case, we're talking about licensed professionals who, of course, have a license to evaluate and treat patients who are working with pain. What's the difference in the two different types of approaches and, I guess, their delivery in clinical practice?
So I think that's an important point because there's so many apps out there and there's no problem with those apps, but it's very different from actually receiving a clinical intervention from a trained professional where you're actually learning learning techniques. You're learning techniques to apply them specifically for pain management. So that's a big difference right there. And so coming back to your question about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT is the gold standard. Research has been accumulating on this approach since the 80s, massive amount of efficacy. And what that treatment is targeted to do, in brief, is that really we know that unhelpful cognitions and unhelpful behaviors basically predict worse outcomes with chronic pain over time. So we're looking at cognitions like pain catastrophizing, which is one of the most robust predictors. So pain catastrophizing is a negative mental set about actual or anticipated pain. And so with cognitive behavioral therapy, a key technique is cognitive restructuring. And really that aims to change those cognitions. So it's explicitly designed to change the cognitions. The behavioral techniques in CBT those are also explicitly designed to change behaviors. So we know that sedentary behavior, inactivity, previously we used to say, oh, rest when you have low back pain, that we know that's one of the worst things that we can actually do with low back pain. And so CBT targets changing those behaviors. Mindfulness-based approaches, on the other hand, come at it from a different perspective. So while CBT is quite change-focused, mindfulness-based approaches are really focused on not changing the experience per se, whether that be pain or cognitions, but actually shifting the way that we relate to those experiences. And so shifting the way we respond to those experiences. And so in that way, we're actually learning that we can't change pain, actually. If we could change pain, we could cure it and we wouldn't have any need for psychological interventions. But really what we're learning here is that instead of seeing pain and going, ugh, I hate it, I don't like it, this is ruining my life, we can see all that and we can just mindfully notice that, observe it. And instead of adding that extra baggage onto the pain, with meditation, we're kind of learning to let go of that extra baggage, which we know loads up pain. So I find it interesting because even though CBT and mindfulness come at it from different angles, I feel like they're different pathways to perhaps ultimately the same destination.
And here's more with licensed clinical social worker and meditation researcher Eric Garland.
What does savoring mean to you, and how does that impact on states of chronic pain?
So to put it mundanely, put it simply, savoring is the process of focusing attention on pleasant everyday events and not only appreciating the pleasure that can be derived from the sensory features of that event, so how it looks, how it smells, how it sounds, its touch, texture, etc., but also becoming aware of how encountering this pleasant experience is affecting you. So how is it affecting your emotions? How is it affecting the bodily states of pleasure that can arise when you're having a good experience? And actually, that second part of savoring, I think, is crucially important and involves this process of mindfulness. Because when we're really savoring something, let's say, a beautiful sunset or nice weather, breeze on a warm summer day, you can appreciate the experience, but at a certain point, it starts to really affect you. And you start to notice those positive emotions of contentment, relaxation, or maybe joy or appreciation. And then those emotions also have this impact on the body, right? We start to notice pleasurable sensations in the body. And as this occurs on a neurophysiological level, there's activation in reward circuitry in the brain that is in part mediated by the endogenous opioid system. And that happens to be involved in the body's own natural pain-killing process. So you asked, what's the connection to chronic pain treatment? I think part of the connection is there, that when we're deeply and mindfully immersed in a pleasant everyday experience, that experience becomes so rewarding that it actually can relieve pain. And the neural circuitry of pain and pleasure are intimately intertwined.
And now it's on to my good friend and colleague and professor of physical therapy at Temple University, Professor Annette Wilkins.
And what is complex neuroscience? If you go into the literature and start to read about mindfulness and how it works, it's very complicated neuroscience. How do you begin to break that down into bite-sized chunks for either your student body or for patients and explain, here's how mindfulness works?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to be oversimplistic, so forgive me in advance if you're a neuroscientist, I talk to my students about the left prefrontal cortex, the happiness center of the brain, and the right prefrontal cortex. The right prefrontal cortex I call the caveman brain or the cavewoman brain, if you will. And it is kind of miserable. He or she is sitting on the side of the road, scanning for threat. There's direct connections to the caveman brain or that right prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, the fight, flight, fear center of the brain. When we tap into sensation, the body, the breath, we disconnect from that right prefrontal cortex and connect to the somatosensory cortex, which is activated and has been shown on functional MRI scans of the brain that shows a dampening of beta waves and a functional shift to that left side of the brain, the happiness center, with more direct connections to the executive functioning, to our ability to make choices rather than, again, be enslaved by emotion. Interestingly, you can actually change the structure of your brain by pausing, by meditating, even for up to 8 minutes a day. So I teach my students, download an app, do it right before bed. And if you fall asleep, great. And if you don't, then you've done your 5 or 10 minutes of meditation, of guided meditation. Sarah Lazar out of the University of Massachusetts actually did a study in which she looked at people who have never meditated before and asked them to meditate about a half hour a day. After only 8 weeks, the participants had different brains. Their insular cortex had more density. The insular cortex is that part of the brain that provides us accurate self-assessment. So what is actually happening? Am I doing what I need to be doing right now? The posterior cingulate, which is the area of the brain that has to do with mind wandering, self-focus, became less dense. The hippocampus, more dense. We know that has to do with learning and memory. The temporoparietal junction has to do with empathy, compassion, perspective taking, more dense. The pons, which is the home of regulatory neurotransmitters, more dense. And the amygdala shrunk in this study after only 8 weeks. So I find that incredibly exciting.
And now we hear from the great Vitamala Birch.
The pro and con of an app, so to speak, is that someone's talking to you or someone's guiding you and it's going into your ears. But depending on what their instructions like, it may be a type of approach where we're still separating the mind from the body. And I think especially in the world of chronic disease and chronic pain, it's so important to tie these together. Do you find that there are a lot of approaches that are just focusing on the cognitive aspects of mindfulness and they're not bringing it to that really mind-body connection aspect?
I think there are some, but to be honest, I think the only ones that are effective are the ones that integrate the mind and the body. And increasingly in my teaching now, I draw out the fact that the head is a limb of the body. Because, of course, people think the head is separate from the body, but it's not. You know, it's just like your arms are limbs, your head is a limb. And in your head, you have a brain, which is an organ. And the brain happens to be the place where it feels like thoughts are located, whether that's true or not. I'm not going to go there. So I might use imagery like just letting your brain be soft and imagine that all your thoughts are having a lie down in the brain, in the body. So I think this is a very Western thing, this mind-body separation. Very problematic with chronic pain and chronic disease management. Because, of course, if your body is hurting, you do not want to be there. Of course, you don't want to be there. So you think, oh, I can just be in my head. I'll just avoid the body by being in my head. But you have a body. We've all got a body. So just trying to blank it out really doesn't work. So mindfulness has this incredible sort of counterintuitive element where we're learning how to come closer and closer to the body, which is where we think the pain resides. So we're having to come closer to the very thing that we don't really want to inhabit. But as we come closer with a loving, kind, soft, gentle awareness, then we come closer to what we think is pain as a thing, as a noun. It's just a label. And you realize it's unpleasant sensations that are flowing and changing all the time, just as the breath is flowing and changing all the time. So you can literally deconstruct this concept of pain, which is entirely mind created, as an object, and just rest within the flow of experience moment by moment.
And to take us home today is physical therapist Dr. Stephanie Carter-Kelly.
In some of your training, you teach about cueing and how that cueing relates to mindfulness or pain science or other aspects. Can you give a couple of examples of those and how they relate to some of the topics that we're talking about?
Yeah, so the format of my classes, and I've explained this to my students, we start by slowing down first. So we start with breathing as the meditation to get the nervous system in a state that it can now pay attention. So I lead people through, especially my beginners, a very long breathing practice, because breathing, awareness of breath, I say, is the first accessible way to meditate, pay attention, be mindful. And so I lead them through 3-part breath, deepening the breath, then a longer exhale, which is to really deactivate that sympathetic nervous system and move them into that parasympathetic state. And I say, I told my students, I'm like, I know this is a little bit like, because eventually we're going to start moving a little bit more vigorously, but I don't want to take you into vigorous movement unless you're ready to pay attention to what you can do on this day. So much of my cueing is to feel where you are today. Do you have energy today, or are you tired today? Are you sore from what you did yesterday? You know, we don't do yoga every day, but I have people that walk and do other types of exercise. Did you have a stressful event yesterday emotionally, and now you're not ready for that? So it really is guiding them all the way to the correct parasympathetic response so that they can pay attention. They can connect their body to their brain.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.